Hello, and thank you for joining us for our latest Finovate webinar, Onboarding, Customizing the User Journey. I'm David Penn, Research Analyst with Finovate. Our guest for the hour is Hal Lonas. He is the CTO of Trulioo. Hal, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you again.
Yes, absolutely good to talk to you again. I thought before we get started, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about yourself and the work that you do with Trulioo.
Yeah, thanks, David. Hal Lonas, CTO at Trulioo, as you said. We at Trulioo are engaged in building the world's #1 identity verification platform, and having a great time doing it with the engineering and technology and product group there.
Fantastic. Well, we've had some great conversations, both digitally and live on stage at Finovate events. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. I'm going to go ahead and give our listeners a bit of a preview of what we're going to be talking about, and then we're going to jump right into it. Taking a look at our agenda for today, we're going to be looking at onboarding and identity verification, the risk-based approach to identity verification, orchestrating identity proofing techniques to create customer-centric onboarding journeys, and then we'll spend a little time with some key takeaways about today's conversation. So I thought we'd go ahead and jump right into it. The first step of the customer journey, for the vast majority of us, is often the initial onboarding process. So how could you tell us a little bit about how onboarding and identity verification interact?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, David. Yeah, the onboarding process is key for so many, large global enterprises today. They are, adding new users and thinking about how they do that. And of course, in today's world, so much of this is all digital now. So it's all about digital reach and inclusion and making sure that everybody they want to attract can get on the platform. And of course, that's what companies want to do and makes a lot of sense for their business model. If we flip that around and think about what that looks like for the consumer or for the person being onboarded, they're going to get a perception from that very first screen or that very first ask on, is this onboarding process making me feel like I trust the process? Do I trust the company? I'm going to be asked some questions. So how do I feel about that, right? And that's really key. Those feelings and that perception and that journey are very key to the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the foundation for building a really resilient identity verification process?
Yeah, I think it's all about how that information is collected and the nuances of the screens and the questions that are being asked and just how the user feels about that. So, there's, I think, sort of the right amount of what, we'll call friction. So, we use this terminology, I think, in the industry, we're all familiar with it, but, friction involves how much, kind of how many hoops you have to jump through or how hard it is to present your information and get that into the system. And then, for the responses that come back, what that looks like, how long does it take? What do the responses look like? Do I get asked again? So these, these questions going back and forth are obviously kind of key to that experience. Another one, mentioned here are the channels that we're on. So, so many of the onboarding experiences these days are on a mobile device. So you've got, a very small screen to work with, maybe for some people a little bit of a cumbersome typing experience. So, it's a small screen, convenient device, but sort of a small experience you're working with. So there's also some friction there. And then, I think, when you think about all those channels, so, a mobile device, different kinds of mobile devices, or am I on a desktop or a traditional computer, and what that different channel looks like. Companies want to make that process work as kind of ubiquitously as possible. So they're looking for making it work everywhere and not limiting their attracted audience.
Mm-hmm. You raised a couple of good points in there that I just wanted to underscore. The one that I found really interesting is this idea of friction and the idea that while there's so much emphasis put on having a seamless experience, which everyone wants, nobody wants anything in their way that they don't want in their way, but at the same time, there is necessary friction. That's part of the point. In some respects, is to tick off these different things, the factors that ensure that a person is who they say they are, and sort of that sort of thing, which we all would want. But at the same time, one too many boxes to tick off could be the box that encourages somebody to abandon the process entirely. So I think it's a really responsible way, I think, about thinking about the problem of friction. The other thing that you mentioned, I thought, was the fascination with mobile, that how much of a challenge and an opportunity it is. Obviously, mobile means you can catch people where they are, but how many of us haven't opened up a page, found something exciting, and then started to interact with it and then realized, oh no, I can't do this on my phone. This is too small. This is too hard to work with. So I think those are two really, really important points to bring up.
Yeah, so true. And another one that comes up very frequently is your network connection. So, how many of us have experienced kind of getting partway through a process and then the network drops, or we're somewhere kind of sketchy in terms of a connection, and so then there's another form of unplanned friction that gets in the way of the smooth onboarding process. So, and that's something that none of us can plan for. We're hoping that everything works smoothly between the mobile device or the endpoint and where we're gathering the information. So lots of things can go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about some of the things that are within our control. What are some of the consequences for identity verification procedures that are not well constructed, actually, or poorly constructed?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of those constructs are things like, maybe one too many, box, or, to check, like you mentioned. Another one would be, things where we could provide something like a drop down or kind of a type ahead guess, or we could, derive information that the user's maybe, let's say, location by virtue of where their mobile device is. And so there's things that we could do to help. And then there's kind of, things we don't do to help, I guess. And some of that comes down to really smart, intuitive programming. Some of it also comes down, I think, to, kind of like A/B testing, like companies finding out what works and what doesn't work, and then comparing the experiences or experimenting over time to see where the best kind of onboarding rates and kind of continuity rates of the onboarding process come from. So I think, there's things that, can go well and not go well. I think another aspect of that is, we talked about friction. Friction is not always a bad thing. Friction can also convey to the onboarding user that the entity they're onboarding with is trustworthy. So they expect to get asked some information, right? They expect to provide some information. And if you don't ask all that information, they may feel like this doesn't seem right, or this doesn't seem trustworthy, or I'm not being asked enough, So there's a fine balance here. And if you think about, interacting with, a new bank or a new trading platform, you kind of expect that they're going to ask you a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting point that you raised there, again, talking about the necessity and the importance of friction, and the fact that to some degree, not only is the absence of friction problematic just in terms of the verification, but just that it's something that a person on contact might suspect. That, wait a minute, you don't want to know this, you don't want to know that at all, we're just good. So I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. Another thing that you talked about also is the idea of a risk-based approach to identity verification. I wonder if maybe you could explicate that just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we feel like so much of the onboarding experience is risk-based. So, we obviously want the, onboarding entities, financial institutions and trading platforms and any entity that's onboarding wants to make sure that they're onboarding good customers, real customers, not fraudsters, not criminals, maybe not money launderers. And in many cases, they're required to do that through compliance standards. So they're regulated and required to do these checks. So they're also walking that fine line between compliance and making sure they're onboarding trustworthy customers, and then that seamless good experience we talked about extensively a few minutes ago. So there's so much of this is walking the tightrope, and I think companies are in a very difficult position in terms of how you do this. It's very, very challenging to onboard everybody you want to onboard and yet filter out the unwanted entities. So so much going on here. There's some good bullet points up here on the screen about regulatory requirements, which we just touched on. Also protecting customer data. So another really important aspect in today's world of protecting personally identifiable information, or PII, the regulations we have around protecting that data, and so on and so forth. So very, very challenging environment we live in today.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about the complexity and some of the solutions to that complexity, all the different parts that have to come together if you're going to have that really sort of impressive and powerful identity verification regime. But there was one thing I did want to touch on that you mentioned a second ago, which is the idea of A/B testing for identity verification, which I thought was a really interesting notion I hadn't really thought of. We think about A/B testing and so many other aspects of digital work and so forth. Can you talk a little bit more about the idea that it's not as if they've got to hit it out of the park on the first pitch, that there are different ways that they can test and try to figure out what are some of the best approaches to identity verification, and A/B testing being one of the ways?
Yeah, so true. So, I'm as a software developer going way back, I'm a big believer in experimentation, and especially with user interfaces and with customers, it's hard to know everything beforehand. Like we're all biased coming into it, and we tend to program things in a biased way as well. So, so really, a lot of this comes down to demographics and customs and all kinds of variables that come in with your kind of onboarding audience. So, whether it's whether it's maybe age, maybe a younger demographic is more comfortable using the mobile device we talked about a few minutes ago, and maybe older demographics are not as comfortable with that. Or maybe there's cultural differences, or maybe another one would be the network differences we talked about a few minutes ago, where maybe you can code your interface to be as low bandwidth as possible, and really be, not include like animated icons or complicated graphics. Even though they look nice, it might make the onboarding experience net harder because you're using your bandwidth for that. So all these things, all these variables can actually be experimented with. We say A/B testing, but you might have many more than two combinations, or you might experiment over time. So some companies we work with actually like to sort of tweak the variables over time and then see if the onboarding rates improve, or they'll run multiple experiments in parallel with different interfaces and see what happens, in the different cases. And if you instrument that well, you can tell the exact step where people maybe drop out, they don't answer questions anymore, or the interface wasn't successful and requires maybe a retry to upload information. So yeah, it can be a computer programming challenge to do, but also provide tons and tons of valuable information back. I think the challenge with this is having enough sort of development and engineering resource to do it. So it can be very intensive in terms of the programming and the assessing the data and looking at what's coming back. And a lot of companies are really challenged to have enough engineering and development resources to code all these different combinations and variables and then interpret the data. So it can be a very challenging problem.
Absolutely. And I really just wanted to underscore the point that you made about the degree and the volume of insights that can be derived from this. Just hearing you talk about the different stages, the different customer segments that you could find out from different parts along the process that are maybe working for some, don't work for others, work for some up to a point, and then stop working. It just seems that as unfortunate as the challenges you mentioned with having that technical talent on hand to do all of that processing work and that interpretive work, it really does seem like work that's worth doing if a company can do it, either internally or obviously partnership, because it does seem that the insights that can be derived are just immense and extremely valuable to companies.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'll also point out that another part of the walking this tightrope is you just have to be so careful with how you handle customer data. So nobody wants to have this data around for a long period of time and then risk losing it, or risk using it in an improper way and violating privacy laws. So another really important aspect of this is a very careful handling of customer data if it's going to be used for any purpose other than the actual onboarding experience itself. So another one of those kind of tightropes I think a lot of companies walk in terms of how to handle and how to analyze that data.
Yeah, it really does underscore the importance of it, and the importance, I think, of working with partners who know what they're doing, to be honest, that have been through this before, have an understanding of some of these parameters that you're talking about, some of the things that a company might not think about, but that could be quite critical in terms of not just the success of the improvement of the onboarding process, but of the company itself, and making sure that they stay compliant and within all regulatory requirements, things like that. I wanted to move and expand the conversation to something we've talked about before that is really one of my favorite aspects of this conversation, and that has to do with putting all of this together. as if we haven't talked about the complexity of things enough. How do we manage that complexity? And that gets into the topic of orchestration. And I thought maybe we could talk just a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, about some of the key aspects of orchestration, why it's important, and what companies can do to make sure that that is a part of the regime of identity verification that they put together.
Yeah, I love this topic. And this is something that we at Trulioo are really engaged on building right now for our customers. But let's talk about orchestration a little bit, because our observation was that most sophisticated companies end up doing some kind of orchestration in this journey. And let's talk about the different aspects of it. One of the forms of orchestration that companies were undertaking was putting together different kind of modalities of identity verification in their steps. So, for example, let's say that you want to have a very simple identity verification, like gathering name and address and maybe date of birth or national ID, and then checking and seeing if you could identify the person. If that failed, then you might go on to another step that maybe requires some more friction, like document verification. So, I think most of us are familiar with the steps there, where you take a picture of your national ID or your passport or maybe your driver's license. Then you take a selfie, and then the software in the background matches the picture on the document with your selfie. It maybe does some OCR on the data. Anyways, it's a lot more friction, and that document verification step might be a secondary step in the verification flow if the first step didn't work. And then you can get arbitrarily more complicated from there. You might do different things in different geographies or different jurisdictions. But in any case, you end up having to write software that puts together that flow and that logic. And that was our observation of what our customers were doing. And so, we've decided to offer that as a kind of an orchestration capability or orchestration service. And really, another one of the beauties of that is it also addresses what we talked about just a minute ago. So if you have sort of a very easy to construct orchestration capability or ability to create workflows, it becomes very much easier to do things like A/B testing, because the creation of the various flows gets so much easier, and you don't need so many developers or engineers to construct those things and manage them operating in parallel. So we really feel like orchestration or the workflow aspect of what you're doing in identity is a very important aspect of what you can do, and really helps the process move along and helps you stay organized and really do experiments along the way.
Absolutely. It's really interesting, the idea of, again, it be sort of piling on the different modalities of things. I think we've all experienced that to some degree, especially if we say you enter a password incorrectly or something like that a few too many times, and they want to take us to that next level, say nothing of a multi-factor authentication and things like that. I'm curious, in terms of the companies that you work with, in terms of the top challenges they have when it comes to this step in the process, what are some of the things that you hear from them?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is they either look for another, supplier of the orchestration or the workflow capability, and so now they've got another sort of party at the table where, they're maybe working with somebody to help them verify the identity, like Trulioo, and then maybe they've got somebody else they needed historically to help with that, before we've come along now with our own inherent capability. Or even more challenging, but a lot of larger companies take on, is they do it themselves. They'll have their own development capability and engineering resources, and so you can imagine what that leads to if you want to do, again, going back to something like A/B testing, or even make a change based on compliance or regulatory changes. Now you're going back and changing that workflow. You got to have your engineering team or your development team standing by, and you've got to say, hey, I've got more work for you to do. And onboarding is a critical step, but, developers are a scarce resource, as we all know. And then, saying, they're going to do, that instead of something else is sometimes a tough decision you've got to make. So, I think anything, we in the industry can do to help companies do more with fewer resources and cheaper and better and faster is you know, kind of service we can bring to them. But yeah, I think everyone's challenged with finding enough developers and how you allocate their time, you know, to this problem.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the conversations I know that we've been talking about with a lot of different companies is that talent chase. That now that everybody is essentially getting, or a lot of companies are essentially getting into different sorts of whether it's fintech, whether it's identity verification, or really putting that demand for digital talent. It's stretching it, and it's definitely making it tougher for companies to get the people they need on board. I want to talk a little bit about, and this side sort of it mentions it, some of the different aspects of verification that sort of deal with some of that friction issue that we talked about, or at least some of the less pleasant aspects of the friction issue, and ways that we can achieve some of these verification issues and accomplish some of these things rather without becoming obtrusive to the user.
Yeah, and this is a great slide because a lot of the information here are things that we can derive without having to ask the users explicitly, right? So we can get a lot of intelligence from the device itself, and we can look at the IP address, which gives us geolocation and other information. And some of this information is, you know, very indicative on whether a user is trying to evade, you know, where they actually are or what they're actually doing, and you know, our very sophisticated fraud identification capabilities and you know, evasion identification capabilities help us determine whether or not someone's actually doing that. But you know, by and large, most people are very, you know, trustworthy. They're coming from a location you would expect. We can also get information from things like the mobile carrier they're using, or behavioral analytics, like looking at things like typing speed, or even like how they're holding their device. You know, there's all kinds of super sophisticated instrumentation on our mobile devices that I think most people are kind of sort of aware of, but maybe not. You know, there's like very sophisticated accelerometers that tell how the device is moving. There's you know, a lot of information about the operating system and the chipset and whether the device has been what we call rooted or not, you know, how secure it is. So all that information really helps kind of make sure that you're working with a trustworthy actor and a trustworthy transaction about to occur as someone gets onboarded. And then, of course, the last thing on this slide talks about watch lists, which is something interesting. So there are, you know, watch lists we can access that have kind of known bad actors on them. And so, you know, you can also do something as, you know, kind of simple as a lookup and say, hey, this is, you know, someone you may not want to, you know, allow on the platform because they're on a known watch list. And you know, our customers can ask us to do any or all of these things to help them sort of triangulate on going back to the risk-based assessment of whether they should onboard a customer or not.
Yeah, it's really interesting looking at this list of items and hearing some of the things that you talked about in terms of what devices are. You mentioned the accelerometers, and I think that so many of us are familiar with the capabilities of these devices in other contexts outside of identity verification. For example, you have an Apple Watch, and maybe that's part of your fitness routine or your waking routine, or geolocation when you're ordering delivery, say. So you're very aware of the capacity for phone to let your driver know where you are, a delivery driver, and for you to know where the delivery driver is. So much. So it seems like so many of these aspects of what our devices are capable of, we're all fully aware of. Bringing them to bear for identity verification still seems like such a thing that we're just sort of like waiting for the two sides to connect, it seems. And it just is one of those things that I think as more people and more companies to embrace this aspect, it's something that people, I think, consumers are perfectly comfortable with and already using, but it just feels like that gap is closing so slowly between what we know the kinds of verification support our devices are capable of providing and having more and more companies rely on those instead of the passwords and things like that.
Yeah, so true. And, you know, I think we're all, you know, look forward to the day when there'll be, you know, fewer passwords, and that won't be such a kind of central part of the kind of the ongoing verification we do with various entities, and making that more seamless. And I think, you know, those of us who kind of look into the future, and I know you do that too, David, I think a lot about, you know, what that future would look like. And then I think we have to balance it with sort of the reality of, like, you know, government issued documents and identity verification as it exists today. And one of the things we deal with, and I'm sure you think about as well, is what's the it may work seamlessly in some near future date in some pretty advanced countries that maybe rely more on mobile devices, and maybe are more digital today. But if you think about globally, how long it will take to get there, and for companies, that want to onboard customers globally, what they have to deal with in terms of dealing with all those different, the complexity, the patchwork quilt, if you will, of identity verification. Yes. I think we've got a long ways to go before that will ever be uniform. And of course, one of the things that sort of a company like Trulioo does is, we deal with all that complexity and look at that complicated patchwork quilt of what's out there. But certainly, I think of like what the sort of nirvana of identity verification would look like, and you think about those future technologies and kind of hope they get here sooner, as I think many of us do.
Sure, absolutely. But I think it's a fantastic point that you make about being mature-minded and sober-minded about it in terms of the breadth of the challenges when we think about the big project and the project that a lot of companies that are involved in, which is an inclusive project, is trying to get a lot of folks in, and a lot of those folks may not have some of the same sorts of devices that we're impatiently looking to provide us with more seamless verification experiences. I think that's an excellent point. I just wanted to remind our audience that we are taking questions. We're nearing the halfway mark, so if you do have questions for Hal or comments about your own experience with regard to identity verification, please feel free to share those. We're going to be taking up some questions toward the end of today's conversation, but I wanted to make sure that folks were aware of that opportunity if they did not already know. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the customer journeys and the idea of creating a customer-centric journey. We've talked about the issues of friction on either side of both the good friction and bad friction, for lack of a better way of putting it. But in terms of looking at those key components that are going to enable a journey that a customer is going to begin, go through completely, and then finish, what are some of the key elements in that journey as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, I think so much of it comes down to, the actual, like, experimenting with the screens and the user interfaces and the actual even color, can matter, or like things like the font size, can matter. And many cases today too, you'll be faced with, end user licensing agreement, or a EULA, or an acceptance of the data that's going to be collected, and how that's worded, and I think we've all seen those screens that come up where we say like, hey, before we collect your information, we wanted to make sure we have your consent to use it in this way, right? And you'll have to like read all that, maybe scroll to the end and click a button or whatever. And so I think it's very complicated, and legally we need to be compliant. The compliance or regulatory requirements are always there, but there's so much to that can matter. And I think we've all seen things too, like, click the button if you read everything below, and then, we're like, well, am I going to read that or not? I click the button. Or things like where you actually have to scroll through it, right, and read, and then you find the button at the end. So, these are all different methodologies for something as simple as user consent, and then going on to the kind of the softer concerns about, like, colors and fonts and how many screens is another one. So, do you want to ask all your information on one screen and kind of get all that collected and then say go? Or are you going to kind of walk the user through what's your name, what's your telephone number, what's your address, and you're going to do it that way. So, just a bunch of different variations, and we obviously feel like we've seen a lot and can help customers by partnering with them on how to do this, best and what's most successful. But companies will come in with their own ideas about what they want to do or what's worked for them in the past, and we are obviously open to that and want to accommodate that. So it's really about the partnership during the early development part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I'm curious, you mentioned the testing and the processes again. Are there tools that can help companies with that A/B testing? I mean, it sounds complex on the one end, but just so incredibly valuable at the other. Some of the things that you were mentioning in terms of, for example, for something as small as color, to the idea of deciding whether or not you try to just catch them in one big blast, or you try to take them on a journey and hope they'll stay with you. Are there solutions out there that can help folks with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think sometimes companies collect like a little bit of data and they look at it and they think they've they can draw conclusions from that. Sometimes I think that they haven't even collected enough data. There's not really enough data points to be statistically significant and conclusive. Sometimes I think there's a lot of data. You can be overwhelmed by data if you've done a lot of instrumentation and you want to look at it. I think a classic tool like Tableau is always a really good approach to look at a lot of data. I think if you have the resources, collecting information in what we call a data lake, to analyze it is really helpful. So, but again, all this takes resources and data scientists and very sophisticated engineering types that can look at this data and figure it out and help you with kind of avoid the pitfalls, I would say, of maybe drawing conclusions where you shouldn't, or what additional, like, so a good example is like, have you built in biases to the testing where your assumptions are going to be wrong from the very beginning because maybe the experiment was flawed in the way it was set up, and it just takes a lot of experience to know kind of how to set those up and how to run those tests as well.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Interesting. So as we were talking again about the onboarding journeys with regard to customers, one of the other issues that you talked about was the types of friction. That there's good friction, is bad friction, but there's also an issue of just how much. You talked about a tightrope as one of your metaphors.
Yeah. I mean, the tightrope of how much friction. So, onboarding very easily, maybe not doing enough checking, and also then kind of conveying to your customers that, hey, we're pretty loose here at XY Bank. We don't really care too much, and come on board. But that might make you feel a little bit like, wow, they just take anybody. They didn't ask me enough questions, or then going too far, right? Like what? Like, why do you need all this information so early in the process? Like maybe we could get to know each other a little bit, and then you can ask me more. So yeah. So I think there's just this very kind of sophisticated. There's finesse to it. There's how you do it, and I think all of us have been through enough onboarding experiences where we probably felt the difference of and seen that, and also, I mean, also we all know, and we're kind of saying this in so many words, but there's no standardization of this at all, right? So companies are really left to figure this out without, I don't know of a book on the shelf somewhere you can go get that says, here's kind of best practices for onboarding, but there's a lot of, kind of good user interface design books and things about, how to create a good user experience, but the actual onboarding experience is a very, I think, sophisticated set of steps. And yeah, like I like to use that terminology of a tightrope because you're balancing so many different kind of forces at work here.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the idea of an appropriate level of friction. I mean, there's some engagements that you really don't want a lot of friction. There shouldn't need to be a lot of friction. It's a relatively casual engagement. You just need a little bit of information. And then every now and then you begin those journeys and you realize that, wow, you want a lot more than you really need. Are you just asking me questions because you kind of got me here? A kind of syndrome. And then, of course, you mentioned the other one where you feel like not enough information is being asked and that maybe things aren't as secure as they could be. People aren't quite making sure that all of the I's are dotted in the way that they could be, and how companies need to decide. Just because you have your customer before you, you can't just bombard them with questions because you think you've got them. And now here's the opportunity to try to get all this information. That might be, for that particular experience, just more engagement than the customer wants. And it's like, well, no, I don't need all of that for just this little thing. I'm going to go elsewhere instead.
Yeah. Another thing we haven't really touched on too much, but very interesting to me is there's a lot of kind of age verification use cases coming up now where you may want to limit things you're selling, or or access to certain aspects of your platform, like maybe certain sort of age-related, videos you might have, or information to kind of at or above a certain age threshold. So, another form of compliance and onboarding these days is about figuring out how old someone is. And so, I think that's an interesting thing that's coming up a lot with like gaming platforms, and like I said, access to videos and things like that. So I think, there's also sort of these areas of identity verification that are interesting when you just talk about like one aspect of it. So if you just talk about age all by itself, there's a whole set of nuances and kind of specific verification techniques you might apply to that. To again, you want to keep it frictionless for adults, right? But you want to create a ton of friction to make sure you really have done your homework if somebody like underage basically is trying to access your platform and you're trying to figure that out. So there's some really good and interesting variations on this theme as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example. I suspect I tend not to think of the age requirement aspect as an onboarding issue, but it very much is, and a very important one, increasingly important one. It definitely kind of gives you a reminder of how, in a sense, young we still are in this internet engaged world. That's something that you would think would be as basic as being able to know who people are, that people are the right age, is still something we're working on here, decades into our internet experience. I thought we could take a look at some of the other things that you mentioned here that I thought were important. We talked a bit about testing on the front end, but the idea of reviewing and revisiting the programs equally, if not more important as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, so important. And again, I think, it kind of goes back to that. Are we collecting information as we go, or are we watching where the drop-offs occur? And none of that happens by default, by the way. That requires sort of instrumentation of our applications to say, so many users got to this step, then I lost them, right here. So being able to observe that, and then having the engineering team or the developers sort of ready, standing by or available again to go back and help us either fix a problem or go back and try another experiment to see if that variation works better. So yeah, it's the revisiting and the reviewing needs to be kind of a constant thing. And David, I've been in software a long time, and it's very rare to find some developed software that just runs and runs and runs and runs. It doesn't need maintenance. It's amazing how you wouldn't think that. You think about your car, and needs an oil change, and you have to put air in the tires and things like that. But no one really thinks about software kind of degrading over time or requiring maintenance, but it absolutely does, because of all the all the other changes that happen around it, and it's such a fluid universe. So for example, think about what happens if there's an update to iOS or an update to Android, and those platforms, a number of things. They change the kind of programming environment all the time. They also change the permissions that you need. So another form of friction that we haven't touched on yet is that your application, your banking application or your gaming application or your whatever your application is that is going to ask you to do onboarding, it might say, hey, can I access your camera? Or can I access your location? Right? Some of the things we've talked about actually require permission from the user to access now. And a lot of us, I don't know about you, but I'm a little reluctant sometimes when I look at a program and I think, why do you need access to my contacts list or my camera, right? Does it make you wonder, like, well, really, do you need that? And so that's yet another form of friction, but another thing that actually changes all the time in Android and iOS. So my point here was that actually, as the operating systems get upgraded, as the permissions change on the platforms, as other environmental conditions change, these software programs and the onboarding procedures actually require review, and they're going to break over time. So the development team needs to come back in and keep them, change the oil, put air in the tires, and make sure they keep running flawlessly.
Yeah, excellent point. And then the last one, point that on the slide here, talking about working cross-functionally with teams to ensure alignment. I think that's a challenge for organizations of all types. Could you talk a little bit about how that works in this particular context of the customer-centric onboarding?
Yeah, I think there's such a great kind of yin and yang going on in many companies these days, and the tug of war, the useful tension, between the compliance group that's trying to make sure that we're staying compliant and looking at regulations and what are the requirements there. And then typically you have legal involved in some way, looking at the legal aspects of what we're doing. You have things like, your data officer. Are you GDPR compliant? Can you delete customer information upon request? So they're concerned that you are able to do all this. And then you have, engineers and developers who are trying to develop this thing. And then you have maybe the business people who are saying, I want to onboard as many customers as I can because that's my revenue, right? That's my company growth. And so, my direction is to increase usage and adoption of the platform of our grow our business. So you have quite a lot of cross-functional teams here that have to come to the table and agree on the tightrope, the balancing act of, I want to onboard a lot of customers, but I don't want bad actors, and I have to be compliant, and I have to satisfy the law where I'm operating. So it's I think very tough environment, and again, a lot of communication at companies to figure out where they fall, and a lot of times they're also consciously choosing where they fall on the risk spectrum. So they say like, hey, I want to be compliant, but it's not the end of the world if I don't do a great job here, or I'm doing okay, so I'm going to give myself a pass. All the way down to the other end of the spectrum, which is, hey, we've always been super compliant. We get audited all the time. I've got to show the inspectors I'm doing the right thing, and I can't misstep because I might encounter fines or worse. So
Sure.
yeah, there's also that spectrum, and the cross-functional teams have to come together and talk and agree on what's going to be done, ahead of time, and be very aware of the choices that were made.
Yeah, and I do want to talk just a little bit more about that, because it seems like such a key factor that I would imagine you need, the leadership would be a major factor in helping pull that off, and vision as well, so that folks are on the same page of understanding where they are in that spectrum that you just mentioned in terms of the balance between the two. What are some of the things that you would cite as being key to making sure that kind of thing works, or things you've experienced in terms of effective companies where they've effectively had their teams all working together, pulling in the same direction at least as much as possible?
So I think I believe it comes down to a really good, healthy combination of good, experienced people who know what they're doing, and how to, they know their own area, so they know you need good compliance people that understand the context on where you're operating. You need really good legal people that understand that context. You need executive leadership that understands the trade-offs and what the business needs versus those things. So I think you need a combination of subject matter experts, but you also need people that can get along and they understand the trade-offs and they respect the other groups, and they say, hey, I have my own concerns, or I'm pushing my agenda, but I understand where you're coming from, and we are going to compromise and figure out a way to kind of make all this work. So, if you get someone in the room who kind of folds their arms, and says my way or the highway, it can kind of stop progress. And it's a really great question, because in today's competitive environment, if you can't get that sorted, other people are going to pass you by who can get it sorted. Yeah. And I think, you'll look at examples on any industry where you'll find that there are success stories. So one way or another, they're getting it done. And if it takes you too long to figure it out, then the window of opportunity is going to pass you by. So you've got to get this figured out and sorted. And I think it's a lot of communication. And you mentioned a really great word that I love, which is vision. which is understanding where you want to go and then charting out how you're going to get there. But that's obviously super important, and it comes from the top.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're getting near about the 15-minute mark left for our time on our presentation today. I just wanted to remind our attendees that we are taking questions. If you have any questions for Hal, feel free to send them to us, and we'll take them up here in just a few minutes. We're going to take a look at some key takeaways from the presentation. We've talked about so many different things and covered a lot of areas, so we're going to take a moment here to sort of put all that together for you. But if you did have any questions, again, we're going to turn to those here in just a minute. I also wanted to let you know that the presentation will be available in the days and weeks to come on demand. So if there's anything that you missed or there was an earlier part that you really wanted to revisit, you will have that opportunity. Pay attention to the Finovate blog, and all that kind of information will be available to you then. So again, Hal, with about 50 minutes to go, I thought maybe now would be a good time as the last of the audience questions are coming in to maybe look at some of the key takeaways from some of the terrain that we've covered today. What would be some of the things that you want to make sure that people leave here with?
Well, this first one is, I think, just what we were talking about a minute ago, David, which is understanding where you are on that risk kind of continuum, and then what your tolerance is. So different businesses have different requirements. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and so you've got to figure out kind of where you are and figure out how you staff for success and how you develop that subject matter expertise in the different areas. But I would say the most important thing is that the groups come together and you share a vision for what you're building and how you're going to do it, and at the end of the day, what your risk tolerance is across all these different sort of dimensions we talked about. So I think that's really key.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just think in terms again of everybody being on the same page makes it a lot easier for people to just move, and that's something that can usually be sussed out relatively early on. I know that a lot of time there's let's get this project underway, but it's like, let's make sure that we understand what it is that we're doing, and again, like you said, the parameters of what we can do, again, both on the business side and on the compliance side before going forward. And it seems like that's what's going to enable you to move forward. You think in any relationship to some degree, sort of understanding what everybody is in it for, what everybody expects out of that relationship, just makes it much more likely that relationship is going to be a fruitful one. And I would imagine that that's the same as you scale up into companies and corporations as well.
Yeah, one of the things that's really helped me and my experiences is to write those things down and put them together as like, when you get the group together and you say, what can we agree on and how are we going to operate? To write down some guiding principles and say, our number one guiding principle is X. We want to onboard users, or but this is how we want to do it. We're gonna we're gonna make sure we follow the proper compliance guidelines. We're gonna stay within these requirements by legal, and just write those down as sort of a set of decisions you've made if you've come together and do that, and then. You don't need to get crazy about it, but have that something you refer back to periodically and say, hey, are we staying within the guidelines we set out, or do they need to be adjusted? But are we operating within those guidelines? And then share them broadly with the group. So, everybody from engineers to compliance people to folks on the legal team who actually have to read legal agreements every day. That they're all kind of on the same page. So that's really helped me a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, you talked about the idea of compliance, security, and convenience converge to create positive digital experiences. Could you talk a little bit about that takeaway, perhaps?
Yeah, so, at the end of the day, I think, it's got to be a positive experience. So, it can go too far where, maybe we're reading a lot of very small print, right? And we think like, wow, this is kind of hard or tough. So maybe that's not a positive digital experience, but maybe there's ways around that where we can say, just make it more positive. And so I think across the board, you can just decide whether the decisions. And again, I think one of the things that has helped me in the past too is to actually walk everybody through the actual onboarding experience that's on the team. Say, hey, I want to get everyone together Monday morning. Let's all talk. Let's go through what the current experience is. And right. Kind of, I think sometimes we talk about things in the abstract, and maybe the compliance people or legal people or the business people say this is what we want, but they actually don't experience it. So actually walking everybody through it and saying, let's do this as a shared experience, or actually requiring everybody to create an account on the platform and see how that goes. And then they're sort of confronted with it. They go, oh, I see what you mean. That's a lot of steps, or that's a lot of small print, or a lot of reading. Then they experience it for themselves, and the business people and maybe the compliance and the legal people can all come together and say, oh, I get it now. Let's figure out a way to work together and make that easier. But really sharing the experience and figuring out what that looks like is key.
Yeah, excellent. It's sort of you trust the restaurant where the chef eats at his own table.
Totally.
And also I like the idea that you mentioned before. Yeah, yeah. That mentioned before about right fits too. That there are different sorts of onboarding experiences. It's not a one size fit all. And what might work perfectly well for a smaller circumstance or a large circumstance might not work the other way around. I thought that was a really key insight that you shared as well.
Yeah.
And then the last one I think is interesting. We didn't talk a ton about it, but we've hinted at it a couple of times in our conversation. The idea of establishing predictable governance procedures. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think, maybe it goes back to the previous comment about writing it down, but I think in terms of governance procedures, like that ought to be recorded and written down and shared broadly with the team. So, all those governance procedures, and I think, we do that in other areas when we think about things like ISO audits, or if a customer is coming in and auditing us for, for various purposes. A lot of us have thought about ways to make that easier, basically to encapsulate the answers or make the work reusable in some way, so we're not starting from scratch every time. But I think establishing procedures is like that as well, where just writing down the procedures, having the governance procedures, and making sure that they're accessible by those that need to know, and we point to them and use them as part of the standard business process is also very important. So just making sure, and I know there's a lot of different variability out there in terms of company maturity, and maybe some people on this call are going like, oh my gosh, I live and breathe and eat and die by this stuff. I understand it very well, and maybe there's other companies on the call that thought that think well, we should go do that. We haven't done it yet. So I think there's just a lot of variation in terms of maturity of companies. And maybe what you're doing and the requirements as well. But I think, writing stuff down and sharing it is really important. Even if you're a small company that hopes to become big someday, which we all do, having those things documented and establishing them, and they're gonna change over time. But at least you've got a beachhead and a place to get started.
Absolutely. Some excellent takeaways from our conversation today. We do have a few questions that have come in, and we've got about 7 minutes or so. So I definitely think we've got time to go ahead and address them. I think they really do kind of cover some nice ground here. The first one here is how do businesses stay ahead of the curve when it comes to monitoring evolving regulations?
That's a great question, and I think what we found and see in terms of that is that you almost have to dedicate, if not full-time people, you have to dedicate part of someone's job into keeping up. So you have to have your kind of ear to the rail on what regulations are coming up and what's going on. There's a lot of great industry forums and a lot of great government forums that sort of track the progress of these regulations over time and what's happening. And I think it's pretty predictable in many cases, and it's I think generally things are getting tighter and more regulated and more kind of watched over. But I mean there's all kinds of interesting things, right? Like I know the UK is actually having a discussion about GDPR, and how that affects the economy, right? We've seen that in the news. So how you keep track of this stuff is really, you've got to dedicate some people or part of someone's time to just watching and monitoring that, and then I think bringing that information back to the executive team and the stakeholders and making sure they're aware of what's coming and what the timing is, so you can plan for those changes well ahead of time. Great question.
Yeah, and a great answer that it's a talent thing. It's something that's come up a couple of times. You need people in positions to do these things to make sure they
Yeah.
happen. One other question that we had here is interesting, and it does touch on some things that we talked about a little while ago. What does orchestration signify for the future of authentication? And the question says parenthetically, how might the status quo change? I know we talked about that sort of gap between the password world and then all of these techniques and options and strategies and things that are available on our devices. Where do you see us going with regard to all of that? And maybe at what pace, perhaps, do you see us getting there?
It's a great question, and I love that question. I think about this all the time, so super happy that came up. So I think, I think the status quo today is that a lot of people are building their own orchestration themselves in-house, which means they've created something they're going to have to maintain and address in the future. I think other, vendors and partners and entities like Trulioo, is we're supplying an orchestration workflow capability now, and so that's really important in the future because I think it takes the workload and the burden off of companies. But the future of this and what it allows you to do is just amazing. So let me talk about that just for a second. So first of all, the ability to construct new flows by bringing different identity verification elements together and then tying those into this. One thing I didn't talk about is tying that into your own systems downstream. So, basically once you've verified an identity, however many steps or whatever kind of journey you took through your workflow to do it, that information should flow right into your databases. So you've got that customer now onboarded, making sure you can get that information and extract it and put it in your databases, and probably also like what steps it took to through the onboarding journey to get them there is also important. Secondly, is the ability to kind of do A/B testing with orchestration. As we mentioned, you want to do those kind of variations in those tests, and orchestration, especially if it's a very simple interface to construct or change orchestration over time, makes a big difference in your ability to do A/B testing or other complicated testing and compare results. Thirdly, and this is a more future visionary kind of thing, is imagine that you could instrument the orchestration to figure out what's working and what's not, and actually either suggest or make changes automatically to improve the onboarding journey. So you could actually imagine a future, right, where you're using like AI to watch the journey and then say, hey, I'm going to adaptively change it based on what I'm seeing with no human intervention. So not even requiring the programmers or the analysts to get involved. And maybe step one is just making recommendations, but maybe ultimately actually changing the flow to onboard customers. And you could solve for better compliance, better match rates, and better onboarding rates. You could kind of do what you want to do based on how you would set that up. So I just think there's a ton of possibility for this in the future and very exciting prospects moving forward.
Yeah, it definitely is. And just hearing you talk about it, you can almost see it's almost like a constellation. You can sort of see all of these things sort of swirling around, and you're just waiting for that picture to come into sharper focus. But you can see so many of the components just sitting there and just thinking sooner or later we're going to figure out the combinations, the ways to really make a lot of this sort of integrate, automate, and really work together. And that really is going to be an incredible identity verification regime when it gets here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right, and that's what the future holds for us. It's very exciting.
It very much is. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'm afraid we've taken ourselves up to the hour. I want to thank all of you for joining us for our conversation on customizing the user journey in the onboarding process. And thank you to you, Hal, of course, for a very, very insightful conversation. I thought we got to cover quite a few issues. Always fun to get to chat and to get to talk about some of the new things. As I mentioned, there'll be a copy of this webinar available on demand in the days to come, so stay alert to the Finovate blog for more on that. So on behalf of Finovate, hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. I've certainly enjoyed my time talking with Hal from Trulioo as well. Have a wonderful week, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Take care.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.